Hey, Kyle here with Constant Woodworks. Hope all is well. I've got a fun one for you today. 2 coffee tables that are as unique as they come. Expect a fair share of epoxy chaos, a wood finish I might be banning from the shop, and a few quick tips along the way. Stick around, you won't be disappointed. Unless you're my dad. So, to get 2 pieces out of this guy, I've already started to kind of mark where the center is in each area. This is literally the width of my hand all the way down this, where it's the length of my thumb. Heavy! Get on him, boy.
3.7 fish there.
This thing is not light. Okay, I want to get 2 coffee tables out of this piece. I'm gonna have to chainsaw this thing in half, and I don't really know how it's gonna go. This part makes sense, it's easy. You come to this side, things get less workable. So before I start going ham with the chainsaw,
Shape shiny imitations!
I'm gonna try to start cutting as much as I can into this thinner side, so that hopefully whenever I go through with the chainsaw, I won't have to cut off nearly as much width over here. I am excited to get back working on this guy though. It's literally been like 3.5, 4 years, something like that. We'll get to start cutting on this guy, and then we'll get the chainsaw out. We'll see how it goes. I literally feel like I'm getting ready for surgery on a piece. I'm gonna start cutting it down. So I'm either gonna be using one of these or multi-tool, something along the lines of that. So this piece was actually gifted to me by my first ever client after finishing this beechwood countertop for them. I took on that job with 0 experience in woodworking and taught myself through trial and error the basics of the craft. It took a minute, to say the least, but that's a story for another day, maybe even a video. Stay tuned to the channel if that sounds of interest to you. Whenever I started this piece, I knew a little bit about epoxy just because of that first job, but was totally clueless on how to go about cutting this behemoth in half. 4 years later, I have a chainsaw and a bit of experience with it. Look at that. I'd say on the whole, it turned out pretty good. The chainsaw definitely shredded the out of the epoxy, but that was kind of to be expected. We knew what was going to be the thin area. Well, I really only got to save like this much. It's not a lot. Look at that. It's 2 pieces now. It's 2, not 1. 2 for 1. So I just got done cutting these guys. So this was the kind of thing about these pieces that I really wanted to do, and that is build them on an angle. I want to maintain this slant. The top will be level, and then the bottom will appear to be on like a slant, because it will be. I gotta flatten these guys down, get them nice and flush, and then I'll go from there. So here I am setting up my manual CNC. This is how I flatten anything and everything in my shop. So I finished it up last night with this milling bit. Now I'm gonna take this guy to him, which will clean it up because it looks kind of rough right now. So this is a process where I have to be fully focused at the start, setting up the sled, getting the piece secured, making sure everything's dialed in. But once I get going, it's pretty easy to drift into shower thoughts, like when I hit those epoxy patches and the dust starts spraying everywhere. It kinda looks like confetti, and then I'm thinking epoxy poppers, for people who like celebration and lung damage. It's the confetti that doubles as a health hazard. Yeah, it's probably not a great business idea and I'd get sued instantaneously, but all that to say, it's just one of those activities. Then it was time to start cleaning up the sides. They were in pretty rough shape, so I took out my angle grinder, started to sand them down, and I also began shaping the wood and epoxy areas to better match up with the funky edge contour of both pieces. After flattening and routing down the surfaces, there were a few cracks and knots that showed up on both pieces that I had to deal with before I could move on. For these small but noticeable cracks, I made their openings just slightly larger so they'd be more receptive to epoxy filling them. Things were going well. I was really happy with the progress. And this was just the last little bit of epoxy work that had to be done. So I was making sure to get it in every nook and cranny so I didn't have to do any more down the road. Little did I know, the epoxy that I'm about to pour in said nook and crannies was expired epoxy. It is honestly painful to rewatch this footage. Gosh, seeing the syringe, oh gosh. There's been a slight hiccup. It's been about 2 days, and it's still not even close to being cured. After 5 minutes of disbelief and genuinely questioning my competency as a woodworker, I remember that most problems have solutions, and this issue was no different. So, leaning on Newton's contribution to the world, I flipped the pieces over and let gravity do its thing. Flip them upside down, I let them drip out, and then I kind of just stuffed them with some sawdust. Now I'm going to use a Dremel and hopefully clear them out and get them as cleared out and cleaned out as I can. And the result did and it didn't work. Now this is what you want to see. I don't have to stuff them with sawdust again. So I got to flip them and do the same thing to the other side. Waiting for the epoxy to cure, I turned my attention to the base. It was between two, this metal one that I'm putting together here or the wooden one that's in the background. I asked upwards of 30 people which base they preferred between the two, and it was just barely skewed in favor of the metal base. Even now, I still can't decide. So I am curious, which one would you have gone with? This matte black metal one or the wooden one? Granted, the wooden one would have looked a little bit better. I would have sanded it down, made it look nice and flush, but which one would you have chosen? So I just got the go-ahead to get these things sent through a planer / sander. However, I can't just show up with these literally slanted pieces expecting them to put this through their planer. So I have to build like a little ramp thing so it can go in top surface level with the planer or the bottom. Because of the tear out from the flattening process, sanding it down evenly with my best sander would have taken me about a year. So I decided to reach out to a local woodworking business that has an industrial sander / planing machine to get these pieces professionally sanded down. A big thank you to John Malecki and his crew. Here is the before, and here is the after. Once I got them back, I started the detail sanding on the sides and really, again, just further refining that contour, trying to make it look as natural as possible. I typically break up the sanding process depending where I'm at with any given piece. Since I still had the base to figure out, I paused at a medium grit to avoid the risk of scratching or dinging the surface. So before I go any further with the sanding, I need to figure out what I'm going to be doing for the base. And that is these metal bases. The game plan is to trace them out on the bottom and then route out at a level angle so that the top surface will be level. So for some reason, the legs, they're not at a perfect 90 degree. Like all these corners, they're not at a 90 degree. So I made a template. Now it's not perfect, but the two pieces will at least look a little bit closer to one another. I put a little bit of extra length on the ends here so I can blend it a little bit easier so it's not super tight. So after realizing I made the template too thick to actually use, I just traced it out and rigged the sled with clamps using them as stopping guides. Yeah, the leftover lines didn't look so great, so I tried to clean them up using this violin thumb plane, and I also did a bit of sanding. Now that I have both of the middle parts routed out for the bases, look at that! Well, that doesn't look great. Still gotta figure that one out, but we're getting there. So I gotta do the remaining bits of sanding before I can deal with this and put the finish on. Then, for the umpteenth time, I ran into another issue with these pieces. So for whatever reason, that's doing that right there. Just barely tapping it. And over here, doing the same thing. So the center is higher. So to deal with that, where it starts picking up, I'm gonna mark. That's gonna be like that. The pencil markings are a thing to make sure you're sanding evenly, but ultimately I'm winging this right now. I don't know if this is if this is like the best option that I have, but well, that's what I'm doing, so I guess it is the best option that I have right now. God, look at that. That looks terrible. Well, I'll get it sanded down and it will look a lot better. Look at that. That's gonna look so cool. It looks golden. It's gonna be nice. All right, time for sanding. So after a lot of sanding and planning, we finally get to the part where I deal with this uncured epoxy. That's what we're going to be using. I'm also going to start labeling the dates of when I open epoxy so that I don't ever run into the whole uncured dealio again, because this is not a fun process to have to do. So as you can see, the application areas are very small. I'm really only trying to get in the immediate area on it and slightly around it. And then I'm also going to be sealing these X's so that I could then pour a very thin layer of black epoxy in it, because epoxy cures leveled. So that's the plan. I don't know if I explained it, but the reason I'm doing this pour is because I was concerned that sanding it made the surface uneven, and I also just wasn't happy with how it looked. So doing this pour would make the surface level and look more polished. It is the next day, and to show literally the whole reason why I did this, level and level. Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted. Great success. I then flipped them over to seal the other uncured areas. And now I gotta wait about a day. I've sanded a lot of awkward things. This is definitely one of the most awkward things I've sanded. Once the finish goes on there, it's gonna look very nice. This foam interface pad saves me a lot of time. I'll include a link to this as well as everything else I'm using in the video in the description below. For the small gaps in the cracks, I filled them using this black Starbond CA glue. It's tedious but worth it in the end. And with that, it was time to finish off the sanding for these pieces. Since I put down that sealing epoxy over the uncured areas, I was walking a very fine line trying to sand them down as much as I could, while knowing at the same time I could only take so much off. And then all of a sudden, it was time to drill. This was meant to be the final step before I could apply the finish. Or so I thought. Remember when I mentioned I was carefully sanding down that epoxy, trying to keep that uncured epoxy at bay? Well, it turns out that line wasn't as fine as I thought. I am glad that I waited to apply the finish because this is probably the worst spot of them all. It's just kind of barely bleeding through. Well, not kind of, it is. So I'm going through with some detailers which is pretty much just a nice way of saying I'm digging out the areas that are still affected, like the really bad ones, and filling them with some CA glue. Hopefully this gets the job done. It's like the only way that I can think of to salvage it. Hypothetically, aside from scrapping the piece, what would you do to fix this issue? I'm curious. There's only so many different ways other than like gouging out a massive part of the piece and then just like filling it with epoxy, but then that looks weird. I've already made it look more weird with the cracks. Some of them are thin, and then you can tell in the areas that I was trying to fix it, those cracks are much larger. It's tricky. It's very tricky. I think I got them as good as they are going to get. It is finally that time. So let's do this thing. All right, so I gotta wipe these guys down first with some odorless mineral spirits because it removes the fine dust that compressed air or a tack cloth couldn't. So I'm using Rubio Monocoat for this project. I've used it before, and to be fair, the results have always been solid. Now, I might have been a bit dramatic about banning it from the shop in the beginning, but I'm definitely more cautious about using it now. 2 years ago, I finished these stump stools with Rubio, and it was around that time I developed this crazy itchy rash on my arm, and it eventually spread to my chest. It was summertime during this, and I'd been hiking. I assumed it was poison oak. It took about 2 weeks to clear up. Fast forward to now, it's winter, no hiking involved, and after applying Rubio again, the same rash appeared, and that's when it clicked. I started digging online and found a forum of people dealing with the same issue. Turns out, according to the MSDS, it's not the oil itself, but the accelerator that's a high-level skin and respiratory sensitizer. So if I use Rubio again in the future, I'm probably just gonna skip the accelerator and just stick to the oil. Just keep an eye out for that if you do use this finish. Rubio Monocoat claims to not have overlapping lines in the finish, but you can see right here, just barely you can make out the line from like the first pour that I did. Mono, my ass. I had mono in sophomore year high school. Barely caught it with my foot. Ooh! That's literally epoxy dust. It's because I dropped. It's no bueno. I feel the tackiness. I done feel it. At least for these pieces, it seemed like the faster I could spread it around, the less likely those streak lines were to appear.
No, get back here.
That's a wrap for today, but it's looking good. There's so many different tones in these pieces. Go from light to dark tan, orange in the middle, and somehow the epoxy is right next to the lightest part of each of the pieces. Here, I'll show you real quick. So whenever I'm talking about the light parts, that's what I'm referring to. Look at that. It's like, how does that just show up? It's got some over here. I'll take better pictures, but it's got some streakage going. They are looking so good. Look at them. So because of those lines, I ended up having to sand these down a lot more than I was expecting to. The speed of applying and spreading it definitely had a role to play. Like, look at that. It doesn't look good. It just doesn't look good. Needless to say, whenever time came for applying that second coat, I was moving as fast as the government did, trying to cover up Epstein's client list. Can't say I was thrilled with the sheen, and thought it could be better, so I ended up topping these pieces off with some Odie's oil. You can never go wrong with Old Reliable. And with that, I'm happy to say these pieces are done.